Good evening, everyone. How are we all? It is Thursday, the 13th of August, and time for another CocoaHeads. Yay! Everyone went wild. Well, I hope you're all at home enjoying the comfort and warmth. Got the heating on because it is another cold Melbourne evening tonight. And I hope you're all keeping safe and sound indoors as well, because these are unfortunate times. But we are still able to meet together, have some fun, and learn about a whole heap of different things. So let's get started. As some of you know, some of you don't, this is Melbourne CocoaHeads, and we do a range of different things. We have a very active Slack group. We have Twitter. There is a YouTube channel, which you are undoubtedly aware of as you are watching this either live or recorded. So take note of this. Please do jump on the Slack. The link there for Slack is one that will allow you to sign up. Once you are there, jump on the Meetup channel and get involved with all of the discussions that are happening. Now, being live from Australia, we must pay respect to the people of this land, and we do this through an acknowledgement of country. So our meetup tonight is being run on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners of the land. I would also like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Now, being an online community, we do have a code of conduct, and we have this so that everyone may be included, everyone may feel safe and welcome and a part of the community. So our community is dedicated to providing an inclusive environment that is for everyone. It is regardless of gender identity or expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion or lack thereof, or technology choice. Now, to find out a bit more about this code of conduct, there is details on our website. If you want to get in contact with us about it, there is an email address there to follow. And there is also a type form as well if you want to get in touch with us. Now, tonight we have a few things coming up. There's some introductions, which is me. I'm Matt, and I'm giving you an overview of what's coming up this evening. We have Hugh, who will be giving us tips for clear documentation. And then we have Pablo, who will be giving us a talk about Flutter from an iOS developer's perspective. Now, each month we put on a range of different events, and there are also those from around Australia that are putting on events as well. So to find out about the Melbourne events, go to the Meetup page or our website. If you want to know about Sydney CocoaHeads, there is the address there. And also our friends from the Google Developers Group, who are the Android group. I believe they've got an event coming up that is focused on Android 11. So keep an eye out for that. It should be really fun and a good way to learn about all of the stuff that is going on. So tonight, during the live stream and throughout the entire year, we have a fairly active Slack discussion. So again, please jump on our Slack instance. There is the sign up link there. If you have any questions relating to the talks, jump into the Meetup channel, and the presenters will do their best to engage with the questions and answer them in Slack after their talks. As well as the Meetup channel, there are a few others that are fairly active. There is Volunteers, which is for all of the organisers and people who want to get involved in organising CocoaHeads as an event and as a community. If you're looking for work or looking to hire people, please jump into our jobs channel. There are a lot of people looking for work and also a lot of people looking to hire. So speak up, ask questions. That's a good spot. And also, if you would like to give a talk, jump across into the speakers channel. Now, the speakers channel is there also if you want to propose a talk idea, not sure how to get started. A lot of us have experience and we are more than willing to help you out and mentor you and give you some advice. Now, one of the things we love doing is highlighting stuff that our community has shipped in the past month. And we've got a couple of those highlights for you this evening. First up is the people at Up, which is a neobank. They shipped a few things this month. They shipped a developer-focused API, and I've seen some really amazing tweets about what people have built on this. That's fairly exciting. And they've also partnered with TransferWise to enable and facilitate international transfers going smoothly, easily, without much hassle. And that's all pretty cool. Now, our friend Rob decided that feature toggling was something he wanted to tackle, and he has released a Swift package to help people out with this. Now, it looked to make some really good use of property wrappers and other fairly interesting techniques. So I'm sure this is something that a lot of you will be excited about. And Rob's active in the Slack community as well, if you want to ask him some questions about that. So Carlos, who is an amazing designer and UI UX person, decided to take inspiration from the upcoming icons with macOS 11 and released Bondi icons, which is a series of icons you can use in macOS. And this is some pretty amazing work. Now, if you've been active and working on something in the past month and want to highlight it to us or us to highlight it to everyone else, please do jump on Slack and let us know. Each month we are excited to hear about everything going on and would love to share it with you. Now, there is also one more thing that the community has been working on, and this has been led by Carlos and others, and that is we have a new website. Yay! This is pretty cool and amazing. It supports dark mode. It is responsive. It is really, really nice and amazing. So please go check it out and give some feedback. Now, these events wouldn't be possible without sponsors, and we have some really lovely people helping us out and sponsoring us. Our gold sponsor for the year is Itty Bitty Apps, who have been a part of the community since the beginning, really. Sean and his team are really great people, really involved. So it's great to have them as a gold sponsor. We also have some silver sponsors, which is Latitude Financial, REA Group, and Cognizant. Again, long-time people involved in the community have been a part of these companies. So yeah, thank you to them for sponsoring us as well. So that's it for introductions, and we will now get into our talks. So first up, we have Hugh, and Hugh will be giving us tips for documentation.
All right. Well, thanks very much for tuning in. My name is Hugh, and I'm an iOS developer for itty bitty apps. I've been thinking about documentation and clear commenting for a while. I've always been a fan of comments and how they can help us. But only sometimes do they help us. Sometimes they're a hindrance too. I wanted to do a talk about it, mainly to set my thoughts in order about how and why they help and how we can make the best efforts to make good documentation. So I titled the talk Enough Documentation because I want to stress that we only need enough documentation, not too much and not too waffly. Enough documentation to make it clear and consistent and easy to maintain. So unless you've been living in a bunker underground, and I honestly can understand if you are, you will already understand that documentation is necessary. You don't have to look very hard to find developers frustrated at the lack of docs. We instinctively understand that docs will aid both ourselves and anybody consuming our code. Remember, computer code is a form of human communication. If you fail to communicate clearly, you will frustrate your readers. Commentary and documentation are a way of adding clarity and meaning to your code when the code itself cannot do it by itself. Typically, however, developers don't give much thought to documentation. It's left as an afterthought, a low priority task to fix up once everything else is done and we have a few spare minutes. Those minutes never come, of course, and so the problem continues. Firstly, however, I don't know about you, but advice from my senior colleagues has varied throughout my career. At one stage, comments were absolutely essential and needed to be in every place possible. At another point, documentation was scorned as a failure of the programmer to write clear enough code. Right away, I want to point out that this code documents itself is a load of dingo's kidneys. Aside from trivial examples, this will never be the case. Imagine if someone said, UIKit has no documentation, it's self-documenting. No, I don't think that's likely. Plainly, that's silly. Clearly, some docs are necessary. How much? That depends. We can talk about that later. Let's constrain ourselves first. I want to focus just on developer documentation. Documentation written for the eyes of other developers, not for managers or BAs and so on. They might want to muscle in on your documentation and make it about the project, but let's resist that. Their needs are valid and their ideas are important, but let's constrain our discussion to just the developer documentation. But Hugh, I can hear you saying, writing comments is hard. Yes, it is hard. Coding is difficult too. So is learning SwiftUI and Combine, and we manage that mostly so far. I want people to start thinking of documentation as an integral part of software development process, a modern best practice, if you will, as inherent as unit testing and as necessary as accessibility. So since this is for developers, by developers, where should we put it? We want it to be as close to hand as possible. So the best place to put your documentation is in the code itself. I mean in the same Git repository, surrounded by the code, amongst it and part of it. We're going to apply all of our usual developer best practices to it. It's checked in and looked after as if it were code. If it's too far away, stored in some other system like a wiki, then it'll get out of date, and as developers move on, you won't know where to find it or whose job it is to look after it. When it's close by, everyone already has a copy and everyone knows how to update it. This screenshot is from the GitHub page of the RX Swift project. I'm not saying its documentation is perfect. I myself have submitted patches, but it does exemplify what I mean. Here, the documentation has gone into a directory at the root of the project, a fine place to store it. Though RX, Swift, is a big public project, it has loads of documentation because it's quite complex and consumed by so many people. Yes, code written for the consumption of public is always going to have a greater need for documentation. That doesn't exonerate you, however. What should we put in your private repos documentation directory? In most projects I've been on, particularly the ones which have lasted more than a few months, big decisions get made regarding the architectural structure of the project that have profound implications. But people forget about why we did something and what the people were thinking of at the time. Often the people who made the decision have long since vanished. For example, why did we decide not to use Interface Builder? Does anyone remember why we switched from CocoaPods to Carthage? That sort of thing. One way to counteract this problem, and many others, is to use architectural decision records, or ADRs for short. This is a record of any kind of large, significant change to the non-functional characteristics of the system. They should provide the design rationale for the decision, and they should talk about the trade-offs and attributes of the decisions and answer the why questions about the option selected. They're usually a byproduct of a meeting or a discussion among engineers, or maybe a spike even. This website has loads of great information about them, and it's even translated into German. A good tip to start using ADRs is to just adopt a template and pop it into your documentation directory. They don't have to be much. They just need a title, what it's about, a date, some context to explain what's going on and what's surrounding the decision itself, what you've agreed to, the status. ADRs last forever. You don't delete them. If you change your mind about something, you can write in here, superseded, please see some other ADR. Any further consequences or side effects, you should also note that here. ADRs are often numbered as well, just so you can keep track of them. So ADR 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Mostly, however, when we're talking about developer documentation, what we're talking about is comments. This is where the bulk of your docs will be, and it probably already is. These days, there are some excellent tools you can get to generate pretty HTML from your code comments. I got this one here working in minutes. This is SwiftDoc. It automatically generates a nice HTML site from your code comments. You can set it up as a GitHub action or as just part of your build pipeline, publish it to a place where the consumer can read it, and most importantly, they can search it. This is an example of the output of SwiftDoc run against an open source project which we mentioned tonight. It's Vexel by our friend Rob. Rob's taken the time to carefully write commentary as he's written his code. The payoff is now his project has a big set of documentation. Not everyone's going to want to publish the documentation like this, though. You're probably working on private code. However, I think that if you pretend you're going to publish it, even if you never plan to, you will get the best results. Even if you never integrate these sorts of tools, the discipline will pay off, like compound interest. Now, there are some rules to follow when you're writing comments. They're not onerous, but you need to follow them in order to have them convert into this sort of documentation. So let's talk a bit about this now. Chances are you may already know about some of this, but I'm going to go through it anyway because not everyone knows it. So it's Xcode, not necessarily Swift, has some pretty good built-in tooling for documenting your code. It's the conventions like these that tools like SwiftDoc and SwiftLint use to do their work. For example, did you know you could use much of the features of Markdown in your comments? You might not have noticed it before because it's kind of hidden. Ordinarily in Swift, comments start with a double slash. If you start with a triple slash, like here, Xcode considers this to be a documentation comment, and it'll format it with some Markdown rules. By default, Xcode formats it with Helvetica, but you can set it up to use a monospace font if you wish, and I strongly recommend that. When you attach these sorts of comments, these documentation comments, to a function, this is where the fun really starts. Rather than relying on the function signature to explain what's going on, we can annotate the function to add extra information. In the first line, we have the simple function description. The leading paragraph of the documentation comment becomes the documentation summary. This is short and sweet and should be easy to skim. Everything else is discussion. If people want more information, they can look there. Xcode recognizes a few special fields as well and makes them separate. For example, the line with parameters, if you start the line with parameters, you can have a special list of parameters. There's all sorts of additional fields you can use here: throws, returns, preconditions, see also, etc. They're all there. Take a look at the website in the link here, and it goes into much more detail. I'll chuck that link into Slack in a minute. When it's all done, Xcode puts your documentation comment in the quick help. So if you option click on a symbol in Xcode, it'll bring up the window on the left. I use this all the time, mostly for UI kit because it's already written by Apple, but if I've written it too, then I get the benefit. It also puts the summary in the autocomplete pop-up. So if you're looking for what you want, it's important for your summary to be easy to scan. So, but my favorite thing to do is to put in diagrams. So I find this particular sentence to be impenetrable. Don't bother reading it. I could read it 5 times and not understand it. It's very hard to write about RX Swift, and you just end up blathering and waffling, and it's difficult. It's probably an error in this. I don't know. Pictures say 1,000 words. It's good to draw a bit of a diagram to get the point across. This is a simple marble diagram drawn with plain text characters. It's inside a markdown code block. So that's the 3 backticks at the top and bottom of the diagram. So Xcode knows to format it with a monospaced font. And I think this is much clearer now. And it looks good in the Quick Look Inspector as well. So I use Monodraw for this. It's an excellent Mac app for drawing ASCII diagrams. Although I can't show you any today, my friend Simon used it to draw great diagrams to explain how some UIKit views worked with their constraints and how they'd interact. He was building complex views with graphs and layers, and having a diagram really helped out when I came in and needed to modify the code. So consider every time you want to explain something and you reach for a pen and paper to draw a sketch, could you also draw in the markdown code block? This may save someone a bit of pain later on. Now, just because I like comments, this doesn't mean I want people to start writing comments like this one. You don't need a comment on every single function and every variable and every data structure and everything. Swift already has keywords which are plain English already. And this comment here says nothing that the function signature doesn't already say. What's more, it leaves us open to a few problems. Why is it returning a uint? What's the third parameter for? And what does integrate even mean? To fix this, we'll need to explain what integrate means and what the parameters are for. If integrate is obvious in context, then you don't need the comment. It's not necessary, and you should delete it because it's dead code. Restrict your code comments to discussing things which can't be explained by the code itself. The code is sort of the how, and the comment will sort of be the why, as it were. So before I finish on comments, there's one more kind of comment that I'd like to talk about. It's simple, plain git commit messages. These are a kind of comment. There's a lot of good prior art about good commit messages, so I'm not going to go into it, but the rules here are similar to writing good comments. That is, bad ones are worse than none at all, and simple is best. The thing about git commits is you have to write them, so it pays to do it properly. Personally, I have a simple pattern and I just stick to it. You don't have to follow it rigidly, and not all commits need to have all of it. I write a single line summary in the top, a very short sentence. Then I write previously, blah, 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 something about the code as it was before the commit. And then now I explain the change I made. Like a lot of this stuff, it all adds up. This one pays off quickly because it helps me to write full-bodied and complete pull requests, because most of what I want to say is already in the commit messages. So before I leave you, I have a few other thoughts. Firstly, don't use pretentious and grandiose words when simple ones will do. You want to circumvent grotesque loquacity. In other words, don't talk too much. The person who will read your comments hasn't got a lot of time. Most of the time, a single sentence will do. Avoid waffling. And secondly, keep it simple. There is a lot of information you can embed in comments. You don't need all of it most of the time. It's probably better if you don't. Remember, the result of this is to create a simple document that someone is going to scan with their eyes to find their answers. Too long and they won't read it. Effective documentation covers the right material. If you have reams of it, no one will bother reading it, and all your hard work will be for nothing. And last, it's handy to have a style guide. Most people won't need this, but they are handy to fall back on. I use the Australian government one. It's very complete and quite good. That's a slide that's blank. So it remains for me to simply say thank you for your time. My name is Hugh, and I hope I've given you some ideas about how you can communicate more clearly with your friends and colleagues through your code. I'll see you on Slack. Back to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Hugh. That was an amazing and insightful talk about documentation. I learned that someone had put this idea of ADRs into actual formal words, which is pretty encouraging. And I loved the artistic use of the spacebar on the mechanical keyboard. Sounded like you were thumping the return on a typewriter or something similar in order to get through your slides. So like, right, smash, docs, smash. It was really good, really engaging talk, and I loved it and learnt a whole heap. Next up, we have Pablo, who is going to give us an overview of Flutter from an iOS developer's perspective.
Hi, thanks for joining in. I'm Pablo, and I'm here to talk to you about Flutter and mostly my experience while I was learning it as someone who has been doing iOS for a while. So to tell you a little bit about myself, as I just said, I've been doing iOS for some time. Went from the time we didn't even have Arc, and we had to be careful with the release and the retains, and then of course jumped into the Swift bandwagon. And last year I was very happy when Swift UI was launched and released. But also, in addition of doing iOS and mobile, I've done quite a bit before, and also during my times on iOS of backend development, mostly on Java, but also a little bit on a few other languages. I have also done stuff with web, JavaScript and CSS and all the stuff. So I'm a bit of a full stack developer, if you will, but really my heart is very close to mobile and to Swift. I really like, it's a language that I really enjoy. So most of my experience in my talk today are going to be from that perspective, someone who likes and enjoys using Swift quite a lot. From 9 to 5, I work for a consultancy company as a lead consultant. And outside that, I work on personal apps and also do some apps for clients. And again, all this talk is a lot based on my opinions and my perceptions and how I see learning like a sort of a multi-platform solution like Flutter. So you might be asking yourself, if you've done iOS for a while, where did you end up picking up Flutter? Well, I can tell you that I found myself kind of what you see on this picture, between a rock and a hard place. So someone approached me and they asked me if I could help them with an app. And quickly, when we started chatting and trying to understand what they needed, we realized that they didn't have anything at all. We had to do everything from the scratch. So it was just myself at the beginning. I got the help from a friend and colleague. But we had to do everything. So we had to start thinking and implementing backend services for the app. We had to do the web console, and we had to do the iOS app. So with all the stuff that I'm mentioning, I was sort of okay. Still for a POC, it's a lot of work to do for two people. The idea was to have this app, which is mostly like a sort of an enterprise app, or if you will, like it's not an app that's going to go to the App Store. It's mostly internal for this client. But I found that we also needed to have an Android app. So I haven't done much with Android before. And then I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to do everything. So I started looking into multi-platform solutions for mobile. And pretty much I narrowed it down to Flutter and React Native. And I'm going to explain later why I ended up picking up Flutter. But I decided to go with Flutter. Spoiler alert. So let me tell you a little bit about Flutter then. So Flutter is a multi-platform solution, basically a framework that was released and is created and maintained by Google. And it's not just another mobile multi-platform solution like, maybe Cordova or maybe the more evolved ones such as React Native. I would say the main difference that it has when you compare with the other ones is the good performance. It actually has a very good performance, and it can be very efficient rendering views. The language that you use when you are writing in Flutter is Dart. It's not a very well-known language. It was also created by Google. And it's very close what Java is. It's very similar, maybe not as verbose as Java is, and it's a bit more far away from what Kotlin is. So it's not as nice as Kotlin. Has a bit of verbosity, and you pretty much create classes for everything, similar to Java. So not much of a value types in there. The UI, when you specify your UI, is basically in a declarative way. So most of the comparisons that I'm going to do in the talk today are going to be against Swift UI because it is a lot closer. Like if it was talking about UI kit, it's probably too different compared to what you can specify or write using Flutter. The way that it can achieve this very high performant and very smooth animations in general is basically because it behaves like a game, if you will. It renders everything using OpenGL, and it was doing that the same as on iOS, but very recently they migrated to Metal. So pretty much everything that gets rendered on the screen gets rendered using Metal on iOS. There's all the complexity of the multi-thread environment is completely hidden. So the way that you get to see and run asynchronous operations is by using promises and async await. And they're really going like full on. So they have better support for web apps. So the same code that you write when you're writing a Flutter app, you can render or generate a web app, and they've introduced alpha support for desktop apps, kind of like what you have with Electron apps. So if we go a little bit more into the architecture and how it looks like, so I was saying before, you specify and declare your widgets by using Dart, and you basically say how your app is going to look like, pretty similar to what Swift UI is. Then that gets turned into Flutter engine directives, which when you compile, depending if you're compiling on iOS or if you're compiling on Android, is going to be doing Metal for iOS, or as I was saying before, OpenGL for Android. But of course, as you know, there are a lot of cases when you actually need to access to native APIs, such as, for example, call location. So for that case, you need to write channels. So channels basically allow you to specify asynchronous functions, which in the iOS side will be central dispatch, right? To invoke APIs and then return the result on a block. And then going a little bit more in why I ended up deciding for Flutter. One of the main reasons is my preference is normally any strongly typed language. Yes, I know JavaScript. You can have the TypeScript, which is a little bit more close to a strongly typed language, but being my experience before with Java, I thought it was going to be easier for me to grasp Dart. And the second reason was because I wanted to have something as smooth as possible. And I found very interesting that it just renders directly using the GPU versus what you have in React Native, which is using JavaScript core. In terms of the standard library, or what you basically get when you're trying to write an app in Flutter and in React Native. In React Native, you need lots of dependencies for every little thing you want to do. On Flutter, maybe you don't need that many, but you still need quite a lot. Just to give you an example, formatting dates, I had to import a library. So stuff that you normally get for granted in Swift, you need libraries. In terms of the paradigm that you use to program it, Flutter is pretty open, whether you want to use a sort of a reactive way of programming or not, versus React Native, which is more geared to a sort of a reactive paradigm. And on the popularity, as you probably heard, React Native is very, very popular, but Flutter is gaining a lot of traction. And in terms of the native integration, and by that I mean things like, for example, accessibility or being able to do this multitask side apps on iPad, has pretty decent support in general. It also supports dark mode, versus in React Native, you actually need to implement a few of that stuff. And then, as I said before, whenever you need to access to any native API, you write channels in Flutter, and React Native, you use these bridges, which I didn't get much into them, into the bridges, but I heard that they can be a bit complicated sometimes. So once you decide to use Flutter, you pretty much want to integrate it into your app, and there are a couple of options that you can take. So the first one is if you don't want to hand over all the control to Flutter. And this is the option that I ended up taking. I wanted to have the open door to do something like maybe widgets or, I don't know, any more native stuff, being able to still do it in Swift. So one of the ways that you can do it is with Flutter, you generate a embedded framework, or you can also generate a static library, and you integrate it into your existing app. And in the case of Android, of course, you generate an Android module. So the way that you get access to whatever you the views that you have defined in Flutter is through a Flutter view controller that gets exposed into your iOS app. And this can be added as a child view controller, or it can be presented standalone. And in terms of any other functions that you want to call, you can also access to the Flutter engine and directly do these calls through channels. The other option that you have, which is the option that I would imagine someone who hasn't done any iOS native or any Android native at all would take, is giving it full control to Flutter. So by this, I mean, with a Flutter command, you create your project and it automatically generates an Xcode project and an Android Studio project. Of course, you still need to understand all the Xcode intricacies and all the Android intricacies, like things, for example, like code signing and all the release cycle to the App Store, all the sort of stuff. You still need to do it through Xcode. And of course, you still need Xcode to compile, because as I was saying, you write it in Dart, but what it ended up compiling is into binaries for iOS and binaries for Android. And in terms of the channels, as I was saying, they're all asynchronous. So you basically write asynchronous functions to access to any native API that you might need. So this is how it looks like from the code perspective. So pretty much everything, it's a widget. And by default, the moment you use an app, it tries to use the material look and feel, which is something that I'm normally not too keen to have on iOS apps. I'm someone who prefers to have more sort of a native or more platform look-like widgets. There is a way around that. I'm gonna explain later. But you can see that it's actually quite similar to what you can do in Swift UI. So you have your app. Your app is even a widget, right? And for example, the app bar that you can see in there, you just specify the title, and then within that home sort of scaffold screen, you can specify your body, and in the body, of course, you can start adding widgets. So for example, I just added there a center widget that has a text. The only thing is it's not the same as Swift UI, where you can start adding multiple views. So if you want to have something more complex, like maybe many widgets, you might be adding another widget that allows you to add multiple widgets within. So as a comparison, this is how Swift UI looks like when you use the app protocol announced for iOS 14 and with the trailing closures. Of course, you would never have an app within one file, but I thought it was an interesting sort of comparison. So you can see Swift UI is a lot more succinct in the way you can specify things. So there are a few other things that you can also do with Flutter. In terms of all the iconography, they come together with the Flutter framework. It's very similar to what we have on the iOS land with the SF symbols. So you will normally add them as widgets. As I was saying, everything is widgets. So there is a widget, and then you specify the icon name. And you can do things like set the color, set the background color, or size, stuff like that. In terms of the layout model, uses a Flexbox layout model. And as I was saying earlier in my little code in there, if you want to add multiple widgets within a specific widget, you add these special ones that we have, which is columns or rows or spacers, which they can be very similar to what we have on the iOS side, such as H-stacks, V-stacks, and spacers. It also allows you to have to keep a state in your main widget And so they have this difference between stateless and stateful widgets. This again is similar to what we have with the state property wrapper in Swift UI, but it's not as powerful because there's not such a thing like observable objects or all the stuff all those nice features that we have in Swift UI, and there is nothing like combine, of course. And if you want to get around in terms of maybe not having your app looking like a material app from the get-go, they have these Cupertino widgets, which are a pixel by pixel, very close imitation to all the UIKit views. If you really look very close, you might notice some differences, especially on animations. For example, when you're pushing a view controller into a navigation controller, but they can be very, very similar. So for my app, I use those on the iOS side, and I stick to the material sort of a look and feel on the Android side. They have very limited support for if and for statements within the definition of the widgets, kind of like what we have in the embedded DSLs, and they actually got pretty powerful now in Swift UI. So in terms of the Dart side, basically it's just one-liners. So just an if-in statement with just one-liner inside. And in case of the for, it's again for statement with just one-liner. The animations, as I was saying, can be very smooth, but they are not as powerful as what you can achieve with Swift UI and UIKit, of course. But it has very good accessibility support. So I was actually making sure that, when you change the text size, also when you have the visual impediment sort of dictation and screen reader, all that works pretty well in general. So with all this stuff that we get with Flutter, and a lot of companies coming and saying, why don't we just use multi-platform from now on? And I read a lot, and I hear a lot of people saying, is native development over? No, definitely no, not at all. I think things like, for example, Swift and Swift UI are really good, and they can really accelerate the implementation of your apps. Of course, in my case, as I was saying, just two-person, I was the only one doing all the mobile. I ended up opting for Flutter, but if I had a little bit more time, probably I would be doing Swift UI. And I actually started rewriting just to see the differences, my few bits and pieces of the POC in Swift UI. So as I was saying, there are quite a few cases where you still want to stick to native development. The big one, the main reason that I would say is when you need access to advanced hardware features. So in a lot of cases, if your app is highly geared toward using Bluetooth and a lot of different native features, NFC, all that sort of stuff, it will be a lot easier to just directly call the APIs rather than to have these intermediaries in between. Of course, if you want to have a highly customization of your transitions and animations, you can see that Flutter can be, and in general, a lot of these multi-platform solutions can be very limiting. You don't have as much freedom and as much access to advanced stuff such as core animation as you have on the native area. When you want to leverage on new features or APIs, so for example, we got the widgets now on iOS 14. Definitely need to use Swift UI for that. But say also some other APIs that you want to use as well. Or for example, if you want your app to support multi-window, it gets a lot easier just to do it natively. So to me, all the points that I was mentioning before, they all resume to, if you really want to differentiate your app from the rest, you probably want to still stick to native. I think it's a very compelling reason. Some other things that I consider is if you have a critical app with a large adoption, we all know that trying to understand crash reports and diagnose where the crash is happening can be very difficult even with Swift and native programming. Imagine when you add in on top of that an extra layer of unknowns. It's very difficult to find out what is going on, and especially to debug. And of course, if you want to support tvOS or watchOS, definitely you need to go to native. Or also, and why not, if your app is going to be only available for iOS, I would definitely go for native. I don't think it's worth just limiting yourself using a multi-platform solution. So how did all this project ended up going up for me? Well, I'd say pretty good. We were able to finish the POC. They are now testing it. So we did everything: backend, front end, web, and the app. But I found myself missing a few things. So a few more comparisons and stuff that maybe you might be missing if you are writing using Flutter. So I'd say Swift was the main one. I really like Swift. As I said, I've used a few languages: Java, Go, little bit of JavaScript, and I quite like Swift. So stuff like guards and if let us statements. In a lot of cases, I found myself thinking, oh, maybe I can use a guard here, and remembering that I can't use it. All the power that you have with enums and switch cases, or stuff like trailing closures, as you saw in my previous slide, or protocol extensions, value types, all the sort of stuff. And believe it or not, Xcode. Yeah, I know it's a stretch, but stuff like inspectors and being able to drag and drop things from the object libraries and how you can wrap things now in Swift UI. In a lot of cases, I do it with Xcode, and I sort of miss that a little bit. Swift UI, of course, all the things like preview providers, which I think are pretty cool, and they allow you to basically just say or specify how your view will look like with all the mock stuff, without just navigating into that view. So in Flutter, you do have this hot reloading, which we got now with Swift UI in a way, but I quite like the preview providers because they allow you to just directly have different visuals of your view, different instantiations of your view, and you can really iterate and refine your view. And things, of course, like modifiers, or as I said before, advanced animations, and all the flexibility that you can get in transitions. I think I mentioned before, Combine is something that I found missing myself quite a lot. And also this direct access that we have to all the amount of huge APIs that we got on iOS in general on the Apple platforms. So in a lot of cases, I rarely find any reason to use third-party libraries, and I went to the opposite, just using libraries for everything. So this is how I see the state of play. So on the consultancy side, I've seen a lot of companies asking and trying to drop their native apps and just trying to go open, trying to go to the multi-platform. But I still think there will always be native. But Flutter, I think, is a very viable alternative for getting apps very quickly out of the door, especially POCs, and especially if you don't really have time to learn one of the two platforms. As I showed you before, Google is investing heavily in Flutter. So I think what they're trying to do is they want it to be the React Native of the mobile and the Electron of the desktop. And they have tons of tutorials and really a lot of material. Yes, Swift UI is probably going to be the go-to platform, the go-to language for multi-platform, but within Apple only. So this is a far-fetched dream that I have. I like alternatives. I really like to have multiple ways of doing things. So it'd be great to see Apple just coming up with an alternative. Why they couldn't, for example, maybe implement the Swift UI engine in OpenGL for other platforms that are not Apple platforms, and then keep the closed source implementation for Apple platforms. As I said, I'd like to have that alternative. I don't really think it's going to happen, but it'd be really good to get to have these high quality apps, and also, being able to use Swift when writing multi-platform apps. Okay, so wrapping up, as I said before, Flutter is fairly easy in general to grasp because it has this highly declarative way of specifying your widgets, and so the learning curve is in general fairly quick. It can be very efficient, and you can get like a very nice frame rate, especially when you're doing scrolling and stuff like that. So it fulfills the promise of a multi-platform up to a point. Of course, for a lot of things, you still need to use libraries, and you need to write channels if you want to use, I don't know, Touch ID, or you want to access to the keychain, or you want to access to the user defaults, stuff like that. You always need to still use channels. It can be great for POCs if you want to get something out to market or something done very quickly. But I think it's still not the best option if you want to have a top-notch app that needs deep integration with the platform. And I still think that Swift and Swift UI are really, really good and a very compelling case for rapid development and POC creations. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for joining and for watching my talk. Up to you, Matt.
Thanks, Pablo. That was an amazing talk. Really enjoyed hearing about your experience with Flutter and its comparisons to native development. And it's great to see that Flutter has a place in the world of app development as well. Now, for those that remember the before times and when the Hack Night was run at Cognizant's office, there was a very live, very active, very vibrant Flutter community also holding their meetup at the same time. So it's great to see people looking at it as a bit of tech and bit of technology and seeing, does it have a place for us as iOS, macOS, watchOS, tvOS, something in the future OS developers. Now, that brings us to an end this evening with our proceedings, and our next event is on September the 10th. So that will again be an online event. We will still be in the middle of some very tight restrictions here in Melbourne. So please jump onto our Slack and engage in the discussions, and we will look forward to seeing you virtually in Slack, in the discussions, hopefully hearing you talk on YouTube next month and throughout the times in between. So thank you all very much for being part of our community and joining in this live or recorded talk. And we hope to see you as part of our Slack community and our community going forward. Now, as typical for a Melbourne CocoaHeads, there will be a virtual drinks discussion happening afterwards. So jump onto Slack and you will see a link to a Zoom meetup, which will be for a bunch of us to just hang out, get some social interaction, and enjoy discussing everything that has been going on. Again, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to each and every one of you. And we will see you next month.